everybody. I'm Crystal Byrd Farmer. I'm over here in the US, and I run an Agile Learning Center called Gastonia Freedom School. And our center is mostly kids with disabilities like autism and ADHD and intellectual disabilities. So my talk is going to be kind of about marginalized kids and how they can fit into self-directed education spaces. So I don't have a good idea of who's all at the conference because it's international and there are people all over. So it'd be really helpful if you could introduce yourself and just tell me a little bit about who you are and why you're here. So I will call on Ian first.
Oh, okay. My name's Ian. I'm based on the south coast of England, Brighton way. We run a program for young people who are out of school. We call it a learning community because it's not school. And we have 53 young people aged 9 to 16 that we work with from a huge range of backgrounds, and many also come to us with issues, as you mentioned, like autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, etc., etc. In fact, most have some issues or other that they have faced.
Thank you. All right, Todd, do you want to introduce yourself? You went off mute, but I can't hear you.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Hi. I'm Tunda Todd. I'm located in Leicester in UK because my children attend Summerhill, and I'm a special educator and therapist as well, mostly working with autistic children. So yeah, it's something fits my interest.
Okay, cool. Therese, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm just an observer, really. I'm Cecilia from Sydney's, from Australia's sister, and I'm just interested in seeing what's happening at the festival. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks. Renee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Renee. I'm in Toronto, Canada, and I worked in democratic schools for many years. Several decades ago, I worked at Summerhill, and then I worked for many years at Play Mountain Place in Los Angeles, California. And this kind of education is very close to my heart. And I'm currently working on a doctoral degree in social justice education at the University of Toronto. And my dissertation is on decolonizing the underlying structures of a Western education system. And when you do that, you find that it very much mirrors the Indigenous education. So that's my area of study at the moment. So I'm very curious. I was very much looking forward to hearing your presentation today, Crystal. And also very curious to hear your views on your thoughts on why the democratic education system is still so white dominated, and what to do about that, because I think that's a real problem.
Okay, I might touch on that a little bit, but I'm going to write it down so I can remember to come back to it. Jerry, you want to introduce yourself? Or does everybody know Jerry? Maybe he stepped away. All right, Marco, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm just all the time distracted by many things. I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. I've been working with young people for 25 years, maybe. Recently, mostly with homeschoolers. I run an online school. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear what you think about integrating and including different kinds of learners. Thanks.
Thanks. Nadia, do you want to introduce yourself? Nadia. Oh, it's the middle of the night. Okay, it's fine. It's fine. Kada, do you want to introduce yourself? Or did you might?
Sorry, I'm running all over the place. I forgot, I didn't hear the question.
Just who you are and why you're here.
Well, you know that. She's been at our conferences. So yeah, I'm Jerry Mintz. I'm the founder of Alternative Education Resource Organization. Live on Long Island in New York and was at the first IDEC in Israel in 1993.
Thank you. Kata, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm just sitting in the background, kind of the tech support for you, but I live in Leiston and my kids go to Summerhill School. I'm a Summerhill parent. And in my other life, I was a Spanish teacher, but at the moment I'm not really teaching or just private lessons.
Did you say tennis?
No, Spanish.
Oh, Spanish. I took out my hearing.
I know you love table tennis.
Yeah, I know. Ya comprendo un poquito español, muy malo.
Muy bien.
Okay, Verena, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Verena. I normally live in New Zealand, but I'm in Berlin at the moment with my German family and my mum in particular. I'm really curious about what it is that we're going to talk about, I guess. I resonate very much with what Renee has said. I find that the democratic education movement is very white middle class kind of movement, and I think, I feel and I know that we have to branch out and understand more deeply, what is inclusion, what is integration, how can we get out more into the more marginalized parts of the community and in the global South in particular. So I'm very, I'm curious, and there's not many people of color in this community, so I was immediately drawn to your whatever presentation. I'm not sure what you're doing, but I'm curious.
Yeah, so I didn't prepare any slides or anything.
No.
So this is just a topic that I like talking about. So I guess I'll jump into it. What I'm going to focus on is people of color, or sometimes called BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and then disabled children or children with disabilities, and their experiences in community. And then I'm going to try and connect that to self-directed education and the work that I'm doing in my center, which has a lot of Black children and mostly disabled children. And a lot of what I'm saying is going to come from the American context, just because that's where I live, and that's the kids that I work with are usually, they're all Native, they're all Americans. I won't say Native Americans, but so when we talk about diversity issues, sometimes there's differences in how people experience things because they come from a different background. Even if you are a BIPOC or person of color in a different country, so I've learned that their experience may be different than if they were in the US than if they were in the UK. And that's just because they might have a different conception of their identity. And then the experiences that the reactions that people have to them may be completely different based on all these other parts of our identity and privilege and all those kinds of things. So, all right, I'm going to start with BIPOC children. And like you've all said, or some of you have said, self-directed education is kind of majority white, but really traditional education was kind of founded, within white supremacy and kind of this idea that traditional education teaches values and it has the priorities of white people. And so when you have BIPOC kids who are in traditional education spaces, a lot of times they are forced to kind of hide themselves or become different from themselves. And that also happens in self-directed education. So I'm Black, and even when you're I was in a majority Black elementary school. That's where I went to elementary school. And even in that context, when I showed up as being so-called gifted or having these learning differences, people saw it as, or the other kids saw it as acting white. So me reading lots of books was me acting white. And so there was this idea that, oh, the Black kids are the ones who are cutting up or misbehaving. They would rather play basketball than read books, and they disrespect teachers. There was kind of those stereotypes about Black kids. And because I was acting different from the stereotype, that meant that I wasn't acting Black, I was acting white. And that also showed up in the way that I spoke. I don't use AAVE, which is African American Vernacular English. I use kind of more standard American English. So I wasn't using kind of the terms and the phrasings that people use that are, people that I grew up with. I understood what they were saying. I just didn't use the same vernacular. So that created an idea of me being different. So that was kind of like my home space. I was like, the traditional education system was me acting white. But when I came into majority white school spaces, I was still different, right? Because the teachers now had all those expectations on me of, oh, she's a Black student, so she's going to do this, this, and this. And I had to try and break out of those expectations by showing that, oh, I'm a good student, I pay attention, I was already doing all the things that that were like positive in the traditional school system's eyes. But because I was a Black kid, I was already kind of a step down. They had this bias against kids and expecting how they would behave. And so what happens to BIPOC children is they get into this space, and it's called double consciousness. Who made that term? Double consciousness. Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois came up with this term, double consciousness. And it's kind of the simultaneous view of yourself as, who you are and owning your identity as a Black person, but then the other view of how white people are seeing you in your Blackness. Like when I'm at my house doing the things that I like to do, I don't think of myself as Black. I don't, I'm not looking at my skin and saying, oh, I'm Black. That's not something that I'm being reminded of all the time. But when I go into majority white spaces, suddenly that's something that I'm really aware of. And I think when we have kids who are coming into majority white spaces, the difficulty is that, they are, well, first of all, they shouldn't have to learn how to do this kind of masking and this kind of like pretending or code switching, but they do. And Black kids learn it from a very young age that they kind of have to change the way they speak, change their behavior in order to fit into, what the traditional school system wants them to be. So when we talk about taking these kids out of the traditional school system into self-directed education, we have to recognize that the freedom is not just, letting them choose and have agency over kind of the work that they do or how they play. It's about letting them be themselves fully. And that means in their actions, in their thoughts, in their words, and how they interact with people. And that's where I see a lot of conflict come up, because when I am around Black children, their culture is completely different than white children's culture. And this is Black American children. So one example, in some Southern Black families, it's really common for people to be really loud and laughing and joking and kind of yelling across the room at each other and telling stories and just kind of having this, really raucous kind of like conversation. Whereas in some middle-class white cultures, if somebody's yelling, then they're angry, they're mad, something's wrong. And so when you get into a space and you have these cultures clashing, the children who are, kind of from that more quiet culture might think, oh, this kid is always angry, this kid is always yelling, there's something wrong. We have to put some boundaries on them or make some agreements that they're not going to do that anymore. And what that's doing to the Black kid is just like in the traditional education system, is telling them the way you are is wrong. The way that you do things is not quite, it doesn't quite fit in with our culture. And so that's one of the things that I see in self-directed learning spaces, is that there's this kind of existence of a culture, and there's not a lot of flexibility in letting those kids be themselves. And when those kids are, when they have behaviors or they have disabilities or something that might be seen as negative, then that kind of turns it even into a more serious situation where, okay, this kid needs extra support. He's taking up a lot of facilitators' time. He's upsetting the other kids because of what he's doing. So he's not a good fit, and we need to kind of push that away. In self-directed education, and I'll talk about this with the disability too, in self-directed education, like the idea of agency and the idea that the kid is supposed to be super independent and know what they want to do and, just kind of get along with everybody. And there's some kids who don't do that. They need a lot more support from the facilitators or from other kids to understand kind of what are the cultural norms and the ways that they should be behaving. And I haven't seen a lot of flexibility or ability to tolerate that in self-directed education spaces. And so when it comes to BIPOC kids, there's this culture piece of how do they act in a space when they're being themselves, and is that going to kind of clash with your community's culture? And then it's what are other kids seeing of them and what assumptions are they making? And facilitators, what are assumptions people are making about the kid in that space that may be true and may not be true, but they have to, we want them to be open to that. And then the final thing is, how are we harming those kids in these spaces? And so when we talk about BIPOC, we talk about microaggressions and kind of these words or actions that are really, really small and minor, and probably come from good intentions most of the time, but they still hurt kids. And so the most common one with Black kids is touching their hair or mimicking their accent or words that they use. It could be, asking Indigenous kids about, their tribes or about some of their rituals or making fun of them, kind of the stereotypical Indian actions that kids would do. It could be using slurs. A lot of kids, use internet slang and stuff like that, and maybe using words that are derogatory toward a certain group of people. So these microaggressions, they are minor, but they do cause harm because it kind of builds up over time. And, we know that BIPOC, or at least Black people in America, have a shorter lifespan. And some of that may be related to stress and, less income, less wealth and all that stuff. But I think part of it can also be just kind of the accumulation of these small microaggressions over time. And so that's why I think we really have to be aware of how it shows up in our spaces with our kids, because we know kids aren't always aware that something is offensive. So we can help them understand when it is offensive, but it also happens that parents kind of want to defend their kids' innocence. Parents kind of go, oh, he was just playing, he wasn't saying all that, but it really was causing harm. So it's something we should address. So that's kind of the three things about BIPOC kids. So when we talk about disability, so most of my experiences with autism and ADHD, which is kind of under the category of neurodivergence, I work with kids with intellectual disabilities, with personality disorders like NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, kids who have been abused, so they have PTSD, and to a smaller extent, like maybe I think some of our kids might have dyslexia, but that's like not my direct experience with dyslexia and dysgraphia. But when we talk about kids with disabilities, a lot of times self-directed spaces say, oh, once we get this kid out of this oppressive school environment, they'll be fine, they'll flourish and they'll grow. Because they're not being told that they're wrong, that they're bad, they're not being evaluated, they're not being put in a special classroom, all of this stuff. But the reality is that most disabled kids are disabled all the time, not just in a classroom. So I know that ADHD specifically kind of has this diagnosis that depends on like how do they behave during school time. But ADHD still affects a kid even when they're self-directing, when they want to play a game, but they get, absorbed in some other activity or they lose track of time. So that's still something that is disabling to them because it's a mental thing. It's not just, what kind of atmosphere they're in. So what we've found at our school is that kids with disabilities need that support. They still need a lot of support to be able to interact with each other, to be able to complete projects, to handle their emotions, interacting with each other, and then to learn skills that they want to handle. So I'll give an example. We have a kid who's diagnosed with autism, but she might also have ADHD, and she just learned how to sew last week, maybe 2 weeks ago now. But that's become her thing, like she's gonna sew, but she lacks some of the executive functioning that a lot of typical kids have. So executive functioning is being able to say, okay, I need this, so I'm gonna go get this, and then I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna do this and this. For her, it's just like, I need this, and I'm gonna do this, so there's a little bit less planning that comes into it. And that means that sometimes her projects kind of like fall apart or they don't work quite right, and she's not sure why, right? And so even though she's in a self-directed space and she has the ability to kind of learn from her mistakes, if she isn't understanding why that mistake happened, she's not going to be able to learn from it. And so that's when the facilitator, for me to come in as a facilitator and say, hey, I think you're missing this step and this step. And it's still me supporting her agency and her freedom, but it's helping her be more informed and understand kind of where things go wrong. And I think that's really important for kids with disabilities. The other thing is that when kids are interacting with each other, a lot of them don't have a good concept of social skills. It's called the hidden curriculum for a reason, right? Because you just kind of expect people to know, what to say and what to do in a certain situation. And a lot of autistic kids just don't know what to say and what to do. And so that's what I found is very good for me as a facilitator to observe interactions and to step in if there's a potential misunderstanding. A lot of autistic kids have problems with tone. They're very blunt. They can kind of say things that are facts to them or are actual things, but may seem like opinions to other people. So it's important to kind of step in and say, hey, he said this, and I think he might have meant something along the lines of this, kind of like translating between people. And that really helps with kids who do struggle with social interactions, because even though you're in like a free environment, I think a lot of kids miss context, or they don't have that context, because the only time they interact with kids in the traditional school system is like when they're doing projects and stuff like that. So we have the opportunity to get them in like a more real world context, and then kind of give them information that they may need about somebody's history, or about what somebody's thinking, or about their emotional state, things like that. And so I think it's really important to support kids with disabilities in those areas. So the harm that comes with children with disabilities is when typical kids don't understand the disability. And so we know this happens in the traditional school system. I mean, bullying is a thing, but what may be more subtle in self-directed education spaces is that kids will treat other kids, they will infantilize them, meaning they kind of treat them like a baby sister, and they need help all the time, or they're not as smart or not as able to do things. So they kind of like, they're either overbearing and kind of like a parent figure, or they just ignore them completely and leave them out of activities. So that's one way that children do it. Or they go into, directly making fun of them and treating them in a way that doesn't feel right. And it's, I want to say that in American society, it's kind of allowed because the only kind of portrayals of disability in the US is really of people who need a lot of help and need a lot of support and are sometimes really silly and cute. We don't have a lot of empowering images of people with disabilities. And so I think it's pretty normal for kids to see people with disabilities and think, oh, well, they're either gonna amuse me, or inspire me, or I need to take care of them, right? Instead of treating them like an equal partner. So in self-directed education spaces, it's really important to observe and bring attention to those interactions so that kids know, I see you doing this with this kid, but you're doing something different with this kid. And what's that about? And why do you think that's happening? And what does that have, how is that related to your assumptions about disability? What do you know about disability? There's lots of things that you can go into with kids and conversations about how to treat people well. So that, I think, is everything I was going to talk about. So yeah, I want to see if anyone have questions or thoughts or comments about all of that.
Yeah, I have a question in addition to my original question. I'm full of questions today. So I'm curious about your thoughts about diagnoses being not really telling a whole lot about someone except their symptoms, more diagnoses in terms of trauma. And I'm thinking about the American social worker Resmaa Menakem, who talks a lot about intergenerational trauma and how it manifests and how it gets interpreted as a biological diagnosis, but it's really an intergenerational way of coping with trauma. And I'm curious if that impacts your way of working in SDE with kids, having that understanding of what happened to someone as opposed to what the problem is with them. And maybe in SDE it's a combination of both, but I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I think since we work with a lot of kids with disabilities, but also low income kids, that we see a lot of that intergenerational trauma. And I think it's kind of like a both and thing. Like there may be a diagnosis, but there also may be this trauma that's being passed on and kind of this dysfunctional, dysfunctional coping skills, that a family member may have, and then that the child also picks up. So when it comes to diagnosis in general, I know that the unschooling community is really divided on whether it's helpful or not helpful. I found it very helpful. I was diagnosed autistic, so I found it very helpful for myself and for my daughter. We got a lot of information about both of us that was, specific enough to kind of help her be in a good spot. Our center kind of attracts kids who are different anyway. So we do recommend that they, kind of go through like the evaluation stage, but because I think it's important to have that information, but I also understand that when you get into the system, it's all about your deficits and all the things that the kid does wrong and the things the kid's not good at. And then they start recommending therapies and ABA and stuff like that. And so I think that could become like not good, that's a bad outcome for pursuing a diagnosis. And some kids do need therapy, but not every kid needs it. But I think, what do I want to say? I think it's something that facilitators kind of have to improve their skills on at recognizing and saying, okay, so these are the criteria of this diagnosis, and maybe the kid meets a couple of these, but this is also what's going on with the family history and kind of what the kid is dealing with at home, and how can I be informed enough about how to react to those kids to help them. So when we had a couple kids with, I'm going to say it was narcissistic personality. I can't remember now. It was one of the personality disorders. And my mom is my co-facilitator at our center. And, you know, she's an older Black woman, so she's, you know, kind of was raised very strictly. And the way that this kid interacted with her, it was just kind of like, you know, they exploded every time they interacted. And so for us, it was kind of a learning process of, this is how I was raised. This is my internal triggers. This is what's going on with me. And then this is this kid showing up in this space. And how is this kid showing up? And how can I support that kid while I'm dealing with all of this that's going on? So I think it's important to kind of have a background in, or at least an understanding of diagnoses, and know that, you know, like we say, behavior is communication. You know, a kid acting out is not doing it because of he hates you. I mean, he may be, but most of the time not. So.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think I'm just stunned about, I'm a registered psychotherapist myself, and I'm stunned that you can talk about a kid being diagnosed with a personality disorder. To me, that's immoral, it's unethical. You know, I just don't understand it. You know, to me, kids manifest trauma in different ways, you know, whether it's in their lives, if it's prenatal, if it's carried out generations, it manifests in so many different ways. But diagnosing kids with personality disorders, how does that happen? Like, help me understand that, maybe, is a better question.
So we have like social services in the US, and when a kid is having a behavior problem, they get referred to these social services. And I think this kid is like almost a teen, he's like 13, 14 now. So maybe a diagnosis is more appropriate at that age. But what happened is, you know, he had been kicked out of all the public schools already. And so that's, once they get kicked out of public schools, they get sent to social services and they get put in like a behavior clinic. And that's basically an all-day daycare for kids who teachers can't handle.
But isn't social services and all the other major institutions in the US inherently racist?
Oh, yeah.
Bias. So when you say a kid of color is diagnosed with a personality disorder, I just kind of go into shock.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I think it's, yeah. It is for me, it's like, okay, if the doctor said it, then that's what they said. For me, it's more of like, how do I help this kid where he is and deal with him, you know, as he is, where he's at with things, and not pathologizing his every behavior, because some of it's maybe motivated by what's going on in his brain and some of it's just normal kid stuff. So, yeah. Yeah, so a lot of our kids of color do get kind of put into these institutions just because their behavior is different. All right, next, Verena.
Yeah, just what I'm hearing you say, I guess, is that in, you know, kind of self-directed learning environments, democratic schools, and you know, those learning environments more free, and kids kind of express themselves in whichever way, or they don't get, you know, kind of that may, for kids who come from traumatized backgrounds for whatever reason, that may not be enough, that they need that extra support. And I mean, you didn't explicitly say that, but that's what I kind of heard, that you know, so what is it that this democratic learning environment can, you know, has to offer to be able to include children from those marginalized backgrounds, or that suffer from, you know, racism or whatever else, but they've been traumatized for one reason or another, because of cultural or whatever other reasons. So what is it that, if, you know, sometimes we talk about in the democratic movement about the inclusion, and that it's to sort of white middle class normal kind of, you know, privileged sort of people, basically. So what is it that we need to do, or what is required from the movement, if you like, to be more inclusive, and to yeah, to be to be taking care or including the marginalized kids.
Yeah.
Is that about right? I'm just sort of making this up.
Yeah, so yes, that's right. That I'm trying to say that just because you move them into an SD space, it doesn't mean that everything's okay. So my recommendation, and I think I would try and answer Renee's question at the same time. So I think facilitators, you know, a lot of SD facilitators are less likely to come from like a licensed teacher background and things like that. But there's still some skills that we need to have. And a lot of that's going to be around trauma and around race and around disability and understanding how that marginalization affects somebody's experience in the world. And you can do that, you know, through book studies, through trainings or whatever. You know, there's a lot around adults and diversity. It's not so much around kids and diversity. And yeah, but what you need to understand is, you know, a kid is coming from a particular culture, a particular way of being. His parents have acted this way. You know, he has heard stories about people, you know, of his background being treated this way, and he's bringing all of that to school. So, you know, you can't just say, oh, all the kids are equal. I see them all as equal, and, you know, I treat them all equally, because we know that, you know, as humans, we have biases and we make assumptions about kids, and, you know, we are reacting from our own kind of upbringing. So it's really important to notice in the moment how you're reacting to a kid and really think about it. Like, am I reacting because they are this, you know? And I know a lot of like really progressive, like liberal people want to say, you know, I'm doing the best I can. I'm aware of all this and I'm doing really great, but you still may be reacting in a way that is going to be harmful to that child. So really knowledge and just kind of self-reflection is really important. Yeah, there's a lot of different, there's this book called Me and White Supremacy. Oh, and I guess I should tell you about my book. Me and White Supremacy is a book study. And what she does is kind of, instead of focusing on like white supremacy as a culture and how everything is bad, it's like, let's turn the lens onto myself and think about myself in the context of white supremacy. You know, so even though I'm Black, you know, I grew up within white supremacy, and some of the things that I do still uphold white supremacy. So it's really important to kind of think about that and think about how I'm doing it, and then to consciously like try not to do it, you know, consciously reject the things that uphold white supremacy. So one of those things, if, oh gosh, Tima Okun, I think it's called white supremacy culture.info. There's this thing called white supremacy culture. And one of those characteristics of that culture is worship of the written word. And that's something that I see a lot in the disability, or, you know, with disabled people, is that, you know, this idea of a diagnosis, you know, if you don't have a diagnosis, then you should be fine and everything's okay. And you need a diagnosis if you want to get any kind of social services, any kind of sympathy from people. You know, people will start arguing with people who have who don't have a placard but are parking in the disabled spaces, or who are asking for a wheelchair to get around the building. You know, so there's this idea that we need to demand evidence of somebody's disability before we can treat them like they have a disability, before we can accommodate them, you know, when really we can just believe what people say and then kind of let it go. So that's kind of like part of white supremacy culture. And that kind of leads into how are we thinking of people and relating to people. And so that's kind of what I think we as facilitators and kind of the adults can do, is just be really aware of how we're interacting with people, and not, you know, you can be optimistic and say, I really want to do well, but you have to also be realistic and say, sometimes I'm going to mess up. Okay, I think Marco had his hand up.
Yeah, I kind of had it. I'm not sure if it's any, you've already answered most of my question. But the question I had came from the actual event where I run a democratic school where there's mostly like teenagers, and we got a bit younger student of color, and we ended up kicking him out due to his behavioral problems. So I'm wondering, I tried to like explain his situation and kind of defend him, I hope I did him justice, but like, how do you see the adult's role in this kind of situation where the students' prejudices and that they may have good reasons for kicking him out, but they don't have the full understanding of the situation. So, do you have any ideas? Like, what could we do?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been around for 4 years, and we kind of went through that period where we would take everybody, because we just wanted to have the numbers. And we've learned you really do have to have boundaries around what you can handle as a center, and how people can show up in the spaces. And so I kind of think of it as kids might need to grow a little bit, or change a little bit to fit into our space, just like we as adults, we grow and change to help kids. So at least in the US, it's much more likely for a kid of color to have trauma, to have a diagnosis of something, to have been abused, to have experienced like poverty or food insecurity. And so, yeah, it makes sense that kid might come with some behaviors, because they're surviving, they're kind of in crisis mode the entire time. And again, just because you're bringing into a self-directed space doesn't mean that they feel completely safe and suddenly they can just turn off that crisis mode, right? So a lot of things that we do is, when a kid comes in, I really just work on helping them feel safe and just be like, we're okay. We understand. Yeah, you may push some boundaries, but that's okay. I'm not going to reject you. I still care about you. I still want you to be here. We still have to have like the kind of those, firm boundaries, about community agreements and stuff. But a kid just kind of needs that time to decompress and then start learning positive behaviors and positive ways of coping. And sometimes that just doesn't happen in enough time. And sometimes it doesn't happen the right way. And sometimes my mom just gets really annoyed and says, we have to move on. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it. Like, there's gonna be where you don't want to say, oh, we kicked him out because he was Black, but it could be that there was so much going on that we just didn't have the capability to handle it. Ian?
Yeah, I was interested in, well, the issue is that we got quite a lot of our young people, in fact, at times the majority have been bullied in school. And the biggest group that get bullied are mixed race. It's and because they can't be with the Black kids and they can't be with the white kids, they often look quite white. But then like a boy just recently, his mother is Ghanaian, so he was treated as a white kid until his mother turned up at school, and then of course he starts getting bullied. And in the UK, it's the biggest minority is actually mixed race young people, and it's just been interesting about how their struggles about what is my identity and how we work with them. I mean, and I'm just interested in your experience in the US, if you have such.
Yeah, my daughter is mixed, so her dad is white. And we've had a lot of kids, oh gosh, we've had like 5 kids at our center who were mixed. And yeah, from what I understand, it can be very difficult because you are kind of in 2 spaces at once. And I've tried to help my daughter kind of explore her identity. And, it was almost like disappointing to me that she didn't identify as Black. She identifies as mixed. And to me, it was like, oh my God, but I'm raising you all this and, all this stuff. But, I kind of have to recognize that that's how she's perceiving herself and that's what she wants to be. And it's perfectly okay, and of course, I have all these fears about when she does get into like the adult world and how people are going to treat her. Luckily, since our school has a pretty good racial mix, we don't see bullying at our center. But yeah, I just wonder, and from what I've read about mixed kids, that kind of goes into adulthood, is kind of like figuring out where do you fit in and how do I express myself and my identity and my background and stuff like that. So yeah.
I have a comment, maybe specifically to Marco about the kid you had to kick out. So I worked for many years at Play Mountain Place in Los Angeles, where there's a lot of work on helping kids stay present with their emotions, even if they're really big. And every group at school, it goes through preschool through elementary. In every group, there are so many spaces, safe spaces for kids to be angry. So you're not telling kids, no, stop, don't do that. Every space has punching bags, has newspaper to tear, or rolled up newspaper into soft swords so they can hit things. Because a lot of kids come with a lot of anger that is often trauma related, and a big part is helping them be comfortable with that feeling and express it in safe ways without being put in timeout or being isolated, but actually learning to be present with that feeling in terms of starting to feel safe, because a big part of feeling safe is feeling emotionally safe, and that the adults around you can handle your big emotions. So I'm making assumptions that, the kid who was kicked out was connected to behavioral issues that maybe had to do with unsafe expressions of anger, but I think it's the responsibility of the adults to create lots of opportunities for kids to express their anger safely. And of course, I think when you're growing up in a world that's not safe because you're marginalized in some way, that stress is so much bigger than if you're part of the dominant class in whatever way that is. So I think having that added layer of stress and anger and anxiety is normal and to be expected in many ways. And the question is, how do you welcome those feelings as opposed to isolating or pushing away a child who's expressing those feelings?
Todd, Tunde.
Yeah, and I think it's very important for these children, if there is any background, if it's a family or the classroom or a teacher or anyone who is expecting this child as the way as it is. So it might be, as you said, more issue during the childhood, but as growing up, you will figure out where do you belong, because I know it's not the same, but I'm actually original from Slovakia, but my mother tongue is Hungarian. So I grew up as a minority in a country where most of the people said we don't belong there because we speak another language. But if we went to Hungary, we were the Czech family, not the Hungarian family. So we always had the feeling that we don't belong to Slovakia and neither to Hungary as well, because we lived in Slovakia, but we speak Hungarian, so it was always something like this. But and it's even happened that on the street someone told me, don't speak Hungarian because you live in Slovakia, you should speak Slovak. So it was even bullying from adults, not just from children. But it's really behind me. So when I figured out where I do belong, because for my family, for my parents, it's the same issue. It was the connection. They could support me because they had the same feelings, and maybe for the children with ADHD or autism, it's a bit different because it doesn't mean that their parents has got these conditions. So they might be not understanding as well their children, and they need some help and support how to help their children. So it's a bit different.
Yeah, thanks for telling us your experience. Ian?
Yeah, I'm interested in language. As you know, this Britain and America are separated by not having a common language, as I know from having lived in America for a short while. And like we wouldn't talk about disability usually except it's physical disability in Britain. I was kind of thinking about it as you were talking about it, because we tend to talk about neurodiversity, and Baron Cohen at Cambridge University, who's, you know, big guru on autism, it would say about 25% of the population are neurodiverse, because he would include all the categories that you've included, that we would as well. So we use the language of diversity, of diversity and neurodiverse as a, therefore this person is not disabled, not lesser. But that would be just our way of thinking about it, you know. As Carl was kind of interested in language because of the way in which, like, we use language differently than you do in the USA, and that suddenly occurred to me as maybe that's a difference as well, and where you know, like Greta Thunberg has said, her autism is a superpower, you know, and like one of our ex-autistic students, after some issues, managed to get into university, get a degree, volunteered back, and now is working back with us. So there's never any notion that he was disabled, you know, that he was autistic, and actually he's great with the students. He kept on failing maths, and actually the students go to him rather than to our maths tutor, because they know that he struggled to pass maths. He had 3 goals at what he needed to get into university before he could pass. And it's always been about, well, everybody here is different, you know. So when we're exploring, like we do with our students when they come, their past history, we work with them in small groups around, well, what's been your history? Because everyone today is a result of the past. And again, we sort of want to use a language, well, like neurodiversity rather than disability. But that's just interesting for me. I'm just kind of playing with that at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's still kind of a big topic that people are talking about, like, is autism, is neurodivergence a disability, you know, or is it just that people don't understand it and are preventing them from succeeding? So that's a huge debate. And I think, yeah, I think there's a lot of different communities that kind of come down on different sides of it. It is really interesting for me to know that autistic adults seem to really hate Simon Baron-Cohen, which is, yeah, just because of the way his research is focused around kind of like the, what do I want to call it? Like supremacy, or like the genetic difference, or like saying that kind of like autism is something that is like a superpower. So I think a lot of people don't like that kind of wording.
Well, his latest book, which I've got behind me, is something about pattern seekers, and he's trying to put it in a wider context of people who seek patterns, and I would see myself as a pattern seeker. Mm-hmm. So therefore, in a sense, closer to autism than other categories. But yeah, I mean, that's, I guess, an academic debate we could have separately. But
yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing. Thanks for bringing that out. I'm going to see if somebody who hasn't spoken yet has a question. So I'm going to be like 10 seconds. Okay. I think Renee and then Marco.
Okay. Just to come back to the question I had at the beginning, I think Verena was also interested in how you would answer that question in terms of how to make the SDE movement more welcoming to other races and cultures. And I think part of your answer is to educate ourselves, like to read, Me and White Supremacy. But I'm wondering if there's any other ways in terms of white people can reflect on. I mean, it's hard to reflect on biases when they're unconscious. But in terms of the work us white people need to do, maybe looking at our white fragility or whatever it is, because I think microaggressions are rampant, and I think I've done them myself, but I'm not conscious of them. So what are your thoughts about how to include more people of color in this movement?
Okay, so I put my book title in the chat. It's called The Token: Common Sense Ideas for Increasing Diversity. And so in that book, I kind of go through a little checklist of what groups can do. You know, a lot of it can be done on your own, but some of it does kind of have, you know, you want to talk through things with people. And so besides the education piece, it's kind of like getting feedback from people. And I think you have to be very careful about how you do this. You don't want to just like go to the one person of color, you know, that you know, and be like, hey, tell me all about this. You know, it's better to go to people who are stepping up as educators, people who want to talk about these things, and get their feedback, and then people in the community, and understand how they're perceiving you or your center and the work that you're doing. Because I think a lot of times it just comes down to asking, you know, and somebody can really tell you, like, I know you mean this, but this is how it's coming across. And the fragility part of that is that, yeah, sometimes we're not ready to hear that feedback. So that's another thing you have to work on.
Great,
right.
Thank you.
Yep, Marco and then Jackie.
Jackie didn't have spoken yet, so I'll let her say first.
Thank you, Marco. I guess I was really taken when you mentioned young people coming in, and thought of look like you or me or Mark or anyone else, recognizing them as a human being who needs care and attention and wants to be heard. I started a center in Tobago, which is in the West Indies. It was for everybody, but what ended up happening was that children with autism arrived. And that was because our school system, whether they were white-bodied, black-bodied, mixed culture, whatever, were seen as bad. And so they weren't even safe in the schools. And so it was called Joy of Living Resource Center. So when they came, the primary thing, regardless of what they looked like, was to make them know, as you said, it's safe. Yes, you're going to do things, but we'll figure it out. So I really was touched by that. And it's really unfortunate that not everybody sees that it's important to make someone feel heard, seen, respected. So just a comment.
Thank you. Okay, Marco, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I was thinking whether I should take this topic anymore.
Sorry.
No, you didn't talk about drugs much in your speech. So if you want to have a few words about what you think about the drugs for mental disabilities.
Okay, yeah, so I got diagnosed with postpartum depression after I had my daughter, and I've been on an antidepressant for 10 years because she's 10 now. So for me, it has been a lifesaver and something that I really thought was helpful for a lot of the kids that come to us. You know, it's hit and miss. Like, I don't want to say that all drugs are bad and medicating kids is bad. I just don't always see the value of it, especially when they come into our space and they don't have to like sit still for, you know, hours and hours, you know. So yes, I think drugs can be helpful and might be good for kids, but I don't think a lot of kids need them. Jackie? Are your hand is still up? No. Okay, you're good. Okay, so it's 3 o'clock, so that's the end of my session. And Yeah, thanks for participating. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.